Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. There was a time before COVID that I only knew how to do podcasts if the guest was in my home sitting across the table from me. And I'm not a big fan of COVID, but one of the things it taught me is to do Zoom podcasts and bring in somebody via Zoom. And this is one of those podcasts. My guest is joining us from New Zealand. Welcome to the podcast, Thomas Swain.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute privilege for me.
Tell us how to say and spell your last name.
Oh, it's Swain, Swain. And I have a missionary companion who actually made probably the most perfect joke I've ever heard. I served in the Caribbean, and I remember we went and we were passing one of these jewelry stores, and there was a beautiful, very large set of black pearls. And I remember saying to him, gosh, they're really stunning. And he just looked at them, looked at me and went, oh, don't cast your pearls before Swain.
That is pretty good.
I thought that was pretty good. I never forgot that.
Listeners, this will be, I think, one of a really good podcast. Thomas is going to share his story as a gay Latter-day Saint. That's not too unusual. Perhaps maybe what's a little more unusual is Thomas is sharing this story at age 37. He's been out publicly for just 3 months, out to friends and family for, several years. Doing this podcast is probably the right time to do this in Thomas's story. And our joint prayers, this will help you, especially you younger LGBTQ Latter-day Saints. Thomas has been on this road for a while, and maybe some of the things he shares will help you. Also, if you're an ally or a family member, our prayers, this will also help you. I'll first give you an overview of the story Thomas is going to share. So this is like the 40,000 foot level, and then I'll kind of sign off and let Thomas share his story. He grew up in the UK, lived there for 18 years. His parents joined the church in Liverpool, in the areas around Liverpool, probably in the 70s. I served in Liverpool in 1980. Your parents were not married then, but single people. So who knows? Maybe I crossed paths with your parents at some point in Liverpool. I love that city. And then Thomas's parents moved to New Zealand, and Thomas has lived in New Zealand for 17 years. He's served a mission in the West Indies from 2006 to 2008. He worked at the MTC in New Zealand for 5 years. He created a blog in 2013 called missiongeek.net. It doesn't exist anymore, but I share that with you to let you know how committed Thomas is to missionary work and how much good he's done in our church. That blog had over 32,000 following. Then Thomas went to work for the church in their PSD publishing department as a producer for another several years, traveling around the Pacific. He was the executive producer on the church most successful youth theme video in 2020 called Go and Do, with about 4 million views. And Thomas currently works in video content advertising. Thomas was heavily involved in FSYs and YSA conventions and has been very active, and he'll talk more about where he is in the church at this point. He talks, and so I share all that. I want to publicly thank Thomas for all the good he's done in our church, all the lives that are closer to Christ because of Thomas's work, not only on his mission, but really an extended period of time post-mission, at the same time trying to figure out I think he knew his sexual orientation, but trying to make that work. And he'll talk about, for a long time, dating women. He talks about his strong testimony of the Savior and Heavenly Father, lots of spiritual experiences, a strong testimony of Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon. He's going to talk a little bit about where he is, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but he's going to church less often, and he does have a male partner that attends church with him, and he'll talk about how that's been part of his story that's recently come into his life. And I want to just be clear, as I hear someone's story potentially shift a little bit, my love for them and appreciation for them doesn't shift. I just would say to Thomas and anybody, I'll walk with you on the road that you feel is best. And every story is different. And I don't look at this as a negative part of your life. I look at this as just you figuring out your next stage of life and honor your continued decisions that you're making and the good you're continuing to do in society. And Thomas, one of the things he may share is just he has a supportive network that loves him without judgment. And he'll also talk maybe about his hopes for the future of our church, where everyone feels unconditional love and support. And I think he will share a poem that he's written recently. He's not a poem writer, but he has a wonderful poem that he'll share at some point in this podcast. Is that okay for an introduction, Thomas?
It's more than kind. You can actually take some of those things back if you like. It was too kind.
So
I'm sorry. I don't know if you can hear. There's sirens going off. I'm in the city, but
we like sirens. So we've heard all sorts of background stuff. We haven't had an earthquake yet, so don't start with the New Zealand earthquake.
Don't tell me this is the part where you just turn it over to me.
It is. So you could start.
What are you thinking? What were you thinking? Bringing me on. I'm a loose cannon.
Good. This is the right platform for a loose cannon.
Oh man, I feel like I'm being chucked out the back of an airplane with no parachute. Wow. Do I go from the beginning? Is that the best?
Yeah,
best
you could talk about. I mean, at some point, I think our listeners are going to want to know when you realized you weren't straight, and
yeah.
And how you tried to navigate that during your mission, after your mission, and if you're still trying to date women or you've given up on that. But there's also all these other stories around that, like your mission and all the church work you've done as you're navigating that. So you can go kind of however you want to organize that.
Look, let's take it from absolutely right at the very beginning. I knew that I was attracted to men when I was 11. Now, when I was 11, of course, there wasn't any sort of sexual attraction. There was no, anything like that. But I went to a bit of a precursor to the scouting program called, I think it was Cubs, I believe. And I was 11. Went to the local village hall. I lived in a idyllic, quaint little village in England. You can probably imagine. And there was someone there that I looked over to and thought, it's a nice person to look at. And I'd look away and I'd look back again. And again, there was nothing sexual, but I think, I felt almost embarrassed at the reality that I was looking at someone and I wasn't really sure why. Over the years, it, I guess, became my little secret was, if I saw someone attractive, I'd have a look at them, but I couldn't tell anyone. And I definitely didn't want to make it obvious that I was looking at anyone. That was in the 90s. And then got into high school and, people are getting older, growing, and, bodies are changing. And so, things like sports, you look over and think, oh, wow, that's attractive. But again, gosh, if anyone saw me looking, I'd be incredibly embarrassed. And I went to a high school of about 1,200 people. And there was one openly gay person in the high school who was mocked terribly. That he was a part of the theatre group and had lots of female friends. And of course, I didn't connect or relate with that at all. I wasn't gay. No, definitely not. No way. No labels. And then we moved out here from England to New Zealand when I was 18. And that was brilliant. Look, I'll really, really quickly just give people a quick rundown. We'd never been here before. My parents felt very, very inspired to come here, only for a year. That was the idea. That was the plan. 17 years later, we're still here. And when we arrived, we took a van from the airport out to, I guess, look, if anyone here has watched Schitt's Creek, it wasn't a million miles away. A small town away from a small town. And we took the van from the airport. And what I didn't know at the time was that the road was being resealed. So it was currently just loose dirt, gravel, rocks, all the rest of it. So when we got onto the road in our van, I didn't know that New Zealand had any sealed roads. I thought they were all just rocks and dust and whatever. And then we made our way through the south of Auckland, which is currently where I live now in Auckland. And we made our way through that southern part of Auckland. And again, no one had told me that it was what in New Zealand they call Inorganics Day. And that's the day where everyone can put their rubbish out on the road, washing machines, sofas, whatever, and the council will come and pick it up for free. So we're on this kind of rubbly road, and I'm looking out, and there's just sofas and washing machines and broken, washing lines, and it was a massive shock to flying from London, and so that was the beginnings. That was the first hour of flying in. Of course, it's very different than what I saw when I first landed, and things have modernized enormously in the last 17 years. And so I didn't have to worry about my sexual orientation when I arrived because I was preparing for my mission. And so for that kind of year, 9 months after arriving, that was it. That was all I was doing was preparing for my mission, putting in my papers, and off I was going on my mission. So there was no dating. There was no thinking about any of that. And that was nice because it felt like a blanket of protection, a bubble where I didn't have to think because I'm going on my mission, and that all of that is just off the table, off the cards. And then I went on my mission, and again, brilliant because I'm in the MTC. I'm a missionary. You don't think about that stuff, and I can just focus on teaching the gospel. I'm still human. I was still able to see attractive things in the corner of my eye, whatever, and that was fine. There was only probably one little trial on my mission, and I served my mission in the West Indies, so it's the Caribbean and some of South America. If anyone has been, it's Saint Martin, Saint Lucia, Dominica, Barbados, Trinidad, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Saint Martin. And I was in the French-speaking islands. And then there's French Guyana, Suriname, and English-speaking Guyana in South America. And there was just one. I did so well. I did so well, and I was so proud of how well I'd done. And then my companion in a new area takes me to a house where there's an investigator who doesn't like to wear a shirt and was very model-esque. And I had to focus, just look in their eyes, look away, don't look at anything else, and teach the gospel. And every now and again, his dad would say, put your shirt on. He was about 19, 20, so our same age. And his dad would say, oh, put your shirt on, and I'd think, thank goodness, put it on. But, did really well, I think. And then came back off my mission, and then it was kind of dating time. And, that was hard. I remember sitting, my mission president is incredible. Love my mission president. And I remember sitting in the mission home on our way out for that final kind of shindig, that final hurrah. And he was talking about, dating and engagement and rings and, all that sort of stuff. And I remember looking around that table and just feeling like, look, this applies to the other 11 elders around this table, but this just doesn't apply to me. I wish it did. I wish it did. In that moment, there was nothing more that I wanted than to just feel as normal as everyone else felt and get as excited as they felt about the next stage of life. And then, came back off my mission.
Just a comment, Thomas. That was really brave of you actually share those couple of experiences at 11 and even that experience teaching. You're vulnerable and you're courageous. And I think it's good for other people that are LGBTQ to recognize that, that's what happens to me sometime. And that happened on my mission. And my feeling is, that's just how you're wired. Even though you feel embarrassed and it's awkward, I think we need to normalize sexual orientation, just like a straight missionary would feel awkward around, whatever female, not very dressed. I don't want to say women are in charge of guys' feelings because that's a whole nother space, but straight elders are going to have some of the same awkwardness at times that you're having. So I think you just normalize that. And I think it's a normal thing. We need to normalize sexual orientation and be vulnerable enough to talk about it. And you lead with that. But I also love where you talked about how you felt around here. You've just given 2 years of your life. And it should be one. I remember President Ivory in our home I remember that experience in Altrincham outside of Manchester when he had that final interview. And I was just filled with hope that, I'd accomplished this great thing. And the next thing in my life was to find my wife. And here you are sitting there on what could be just kind of the capstone moment of your life to date, recognizing it's different for me than the rest of everybody else. And that's a tough spot to be in. So I'm glad you talked about that, but keep sharing your story.
Oh, yeah. Well, I tell you that the other part, of course, being a missionary is, other missionaries are people, human. They're just human beings. They're just young, kids, really. And so, in the mission, there is that sort of, I'm writing to my girlfriend and I'm waiting for my girlfriend. I'm going to get home and get married and, all of this. And that is something that you kind of feel like, oh, I've got to kind of join in with in a way. And I think, towards, the end of my mission, I think there was a sadness for knowing that the protection of that badge was going to go, because that badge meant that I didn't have to think about this. It didn't have to be on my mind at all, because I was a missionary. I had no sexuality as a missionary. You don't express any of that. So you think, oh, okay. So when the badge came off, I felt particularly vulnerable. And it's interesting because I guess my next step was I felt really, really prompted to go and work at the MTC. And I realized that people might see that as me then putting myself into another safe area where I don't have to, really think about sexuality. But I was very hesitant to work at the MTC. I really didn't want to work there. I had probably not the best of probably not the best of outlooks on being an MTC teacher. I thought it was brilliant for some people that came back off their missions that wanted to be MTC teachers. But for me personally, I thought, no, I've finished my mission and I need to get on with the rest of my life. I don't want to be an eternal missionary in that way. And I felt prompted three times to go and apply to work at the MTC in New Zealand. And I went, and there wasn't a very positive reception. I went and quite naively said, I feel like I've been prompted to work here. And I got kind of met with that's what everyone says, put your CV on the pile. So I put it on the pile and I called back and eventually I went back in and said, look, I know I've put my CV on the pile weeks ago, but I really think I should work here. And then they found out that I'd spoken French in my mission, and they had a district of 12 Tahitians arriving in 2 weeks, and they had no French-speaking teacher. So It worked out really well. Didn't plan on staying there very long, and 5 years later, I left. So I had the most incredible time working with, I think I calculated it was about 3,600 missionaries, and about 350 from Tahiti over that time period. I've never felt that I've ever had a job more meaningful, where I've made more of a difference than working with missionaries. Spiritual experiences all the time, absolutely all the time. But during those 5 years, again, I didn't really have to front up to sexuality particularly, because I was working 60 odd hours a week, at the missionary training center, and I was able to kind of throw myself into that world. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to lie. There were some very attractive missionaries that came through, but you were a teacher and you're professional and you do your job, and you treat everyone the same, and you also feel there's a veil of protection as well, that you're able to focus, concentrate, and do your job, because it's not a worldly environment. You're in a very spiritual place. I think a lot of people would say it was kind of halfway between a chapel and a temple. People come and go and all the rest of it, but it's very special. It's a very special place. I remember translating for apostles and general authorities, and just, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful, wonderful part of the gospel. And gosh, I couldn't imagine what it would be like to have come back off my mission and not had that experience, because it was as incredible as my mission, but it was like mission 2.0. Yeah. And towards the end, I think I went on dates. I went on a few dates, because I remember that the missionaries were absolutely riveted at the thought that an MTC teacher would go on a date after they'd teach a class and they'd get to hear about it the next day. They loved that.
That's awesome.
And then I finished up at the MTC. And I think, that's when I started missiongeek.net. I knew that I needed to create an online platform where I could inspire pre-missionaries to do a bit of preparation and to get a bit excited about learning about missions before they arrived at the MTC. And I knew that the online space in 2013 was where it was at. That's where young people were. And so, there was, 30 odd articles on there, and they were everything from, do I go on a mission? Do I get married? Or, there was missionary stories. A missionary who'd got taken by a mafia gang out in Japan, and a missionary who'd had, he'd been in Africa and he'd got malaria and he'd almost died, and there was always awesome stories. And so 600,000 visitors came in and visited the website, and it felt great. It felt great to be able to continue doing something in that space. But yeah, during all of this time, my friends are getting married, everybody's moving on with their lives, everyone's meeting people, a whole generation of YSA are on their next steps. And, I'm not. And, I guess, you just make friends with the next generation of YSA. I was organizing, I think by that point I'd organized some YSA events. 500 people came out to this one and 700 people came out to that one. And, that was really good fun too. But yeah, fundamentally, I think by that point, my younger brother had got married, which was amazing, awesome, brilliant. I'm really close with him, and I was really happy for him. I've never felt jealous of other people and progressing, as it were, in their lives. But you do watch from a distance, and you do, I guess, ask yourself questions around how are things going to look when I'm 50 and 60 and 70, and then. Yeah, then I think that was probably when things got much harder, and I had to start confronting things myself. And I think at that point I'd made a decision that I was going to continue. I was going to start more proactively dating women. That if I could date a woman, get married, it would all work out. That I would be accepted in the organization that I was so connected to, and no one would have to find out. I'd be okay, and I could play that role. And I thought, yep, that's what I'm going to do, and I was committed to it. And so dated lovely people, wonderful people. There's no one that I've dated that I don't hold in really high esteem. They're honestly some of the best women, and I always felt awful, breaking up with them. I didn't tell any of them about same-sex attraction until maybe the last one. Yeah. And so it was difficult because I always knew that they knew there was something else, but I didn't tell them what it was. And I think that was probably hard for them because it didn't make sense from a closure perspective to why I needed to move on. Because of course I'd say, well, it's just not working out for X amount of reasons. And I'm in marketing, so you can come up with heaps of reasons. But I wasn't able to share probably quite a large reason. and that was tricky. So that I can remember breaking up with one, and that was the first time there was some suicidal ideation, which was I was driving across a bridge, and it was the first time that I felt like driving off the bridge was preferable to staying on the bridge. And when that had registered itself in my brain, I burst out into tears. I'd never ever felt that before, and yeah, that was really hard. It's really hard to know that you're going to have a negative impact in someone else's life because of something you can't explain. You can't really explain why, and so then I always had this. It was this dichotomy of, if I need to date, because if I don't date, I can't find someone to marry. But if I date, I'm probably just going to hurt people, and so there was always that issue. So I reluctantly would date in a way, and I enjoyed first dates and second dates and third dates, and then if things progressed, I got more anxious as it went on, and the faster it went, the more anxious I got. And then if the M word ever came up, I died inside. It was I was so far from ever being ready emotionally for marriage. I knew that was a step I couldn't take, but I decided I couldn't take it because I just hadn't found the right person. And so I found lots of different people, and no one was the right person. And, I can definitely say it's not because they weren't amazing people. It's because I didn't have the capacity to do something that I felt was the right thing to do from a church perspective, but the wrong thing to do from everything inside me was saying that's not going to work. That's not how you're designed.
The word that comes to my mind, first of all, I'm really moved with that section, is just your incredible integrity, and your desire to do everything you could to make this work and marry a woman. And I think this went on for a decade. And I'm grateful you shared that story about would it just be easier to drive off the bridge and why you didn't. But it was all about just your integrity and not wanting to hurt people, and recognizing that you knew they were probably thinking, well, it's about me and something about me that's causing Thomas to pull away, and you couldn't tell them the true reason. And what a tough spot you were in. And you can't really talk to anybody about this. You don't have community of friends. You're not out to anybody. You can talk to God, and you probably did, but it's just an impossible spot to be in. And I'm sure your older self would go back to your younger self and give yourself a lot of love. But the word I think is just integrity. You're trying to do the right thing here, Thomas. You used an analogy that maybe you'll eventually, before we went live, that was powerful about the ball. You can share that at some point during the podcast, but that was an analogy no one's ever shared before with me.
Oh, well, look, I'll share it now. It was an off the cuff. It's probably not one of my best, but yeah, I think at the time, everybody else is picking up these balls, is throwing them as far as they can. And it feels like that's what they're supposed to do. And, I can pick up the ball, but I don't have the capacity to throw it. And you can pick it up and you can look at it and you can play with it, but you can't throw it. You just can't. And so what you do is you go and you say, well, it's obviously not me, it's the ball. I need to find another ball. And there isn't a ball on the field that you can throw. But, you're on the field and everyone else is throwing the balls. And that's kind of how it felt. Just with all the desire in the world, you want to throw, but you're not designed to throw. That's kind of how it felt.
Good job.
I think,
keep sharing.
you know, yeah, at the time, I didn't know there was any such thing as any sort of gay community in the church. I had absolutely no idea. I grew up believing I was the only gay in the entire church. It's the only time it's happened to anybody. And if it is happened to anyone else, then they've done an amazing job at getting married, having kids, and never telling anyone. That for some reason I'm subpar and I'm not as good as the rest of them because they're so good at hiding it. Because of course at the time, in the kind of what would that have been, 2010 to 15, it was same-sex attraction. It was a challenge. It was something to be overcome. It was a default to be cured. And it was, it was likened, I'd heard it likened to the difficulty and plight of the widow in the church, that, widows also struggle and, they have their challenges and gay people have their challenges and, and so that's kind of how I internalized it. Was I've just got to be stronger. I've just got to be better. I'm just not strong enough. And I think I then had probably maybe about 4 or 5 years where I didn't date anyone else. I'd stopped dating anybody because I was tired of hurting people. And I just felt like, we'd have some really, really good times and I'd connect really well with people and I enjoyed the company, but it was at the expense of hurting people, and I was tired of that, so I stopped. I stopped, and when I look back now, I was really hard on myself. And I think that's where I guess mental health started to take a bit of a dive, and I started to internalize some probably harsh things about myself. I wasn't sympathetic to gay people. I was probably a little homophobic. I was, that I didn't have any gay friends. I didn't know anyone in the gay community. I wasn't going to go there. That was too dangerous. I had this mantra, and this mantra was, if I do nothing, nothing can go wrong. And I think that's how it felt. It felt like, I just need to do nothing. I need to be very, very careful to not go near anything that could possibly tempt or tarnish me in any way. But that was impossible. It was impossible. Like so many people on this journey, then I, very late in life, stumble across pornography online. And then that becomes my outlet. I look back now and I was so harsh on myself. Pornography became the whipping tool. You look at some, you feel bad, you go to church, you say sorry, you go back home. Times are tough, feel lonely, depressed, sad. You look at some more, makes you feel worse. You go to church, you feel bad, you take the sacrament, trying to constantly clean yourself of expressing sexuality in any way, shape, or form. And that was difficult. That was difficult. I like to stay reasonably positive, but that was hard because I couldn't share that with anybody, really, apart from Bishop. There's no one else that I trusted. By that point, I'd only told Bishop. That was it. No one else. And then, then I get to about 30, 31, and it was just like this massive secret building up inside of me that was going to explode. I had to tell someone. I was driving me crazy. And so I told, can I say names on the podcast or
Sure,
no?
Please.
Well, I told my really good friend who, if people know me, they know I'm good friends with an Olympic athlete. She's awesome. She's my best friend. And she had been inactive and then come back to church. So I felt like I could tell her because she'd been a part of life and a part of the world and all the rest of it. So I thought, if there's someone I can tell, it's her, because I don't think she'll judge me. And I can remember we're sitting in the car and we're driving up north. Her husband, a friend of mine as well, was coming up to meet us and another friend. There was about 4 of us who were going up for a little weekend away. And the 2 of us were driving in the car, chatting about all sorts. And I was so nervous. And I said, Valerie, I said, I've got something to tell you. She said, okay. And she could tell it was quite serious. And of course, it took me forever to get it out. And I said, I experience same-sex attraction. And she said to me, she said, finally. She said, I've been waiting for you to tell me that since I met you. And I said, gosh, you don't have to be so rude. It's not that obvious. And she's so supportive. She said, I don't care. I don't care what you are. She said, you're amazing. You're my friend. She said, I love you. She said, I love you even more for telling me. And, you can talk to me whenever you want to talk to me. And so she became my confidant in a way. She became my confidant for probably a couple of years before one Saturday morning I woke up. And I'd received an email, and I can still remember the feeling. It was awful. I'd received an email from my mother, and the email was so well worded that she'd obviously pored over it for weeks. It looked like a lawyer had been over it, because I couldn't possibly have read it in any way and taken any offense. It was simply a mother reaching out saying, I don't know if this is the case, but if you do experience same-sex attraction, we're here for you, we love you, nothing's changed. And I know a lot of gay people that have had a terrible experience with their parents. I've had a very, very good, very positive experience, but it was still incredibly awkward. So I read this email and I remember closing my phone and just saying to myself, I can't deal with this. And so I just ignored it. I didn't respond. I didn't reply. I've got a good relationship with my parents, and I, saw them. I wasn't living at home, but I saw them, every other week for months, probably 3 or 4 months before I thought, okay, I think I actually need to have this conversation with Mum. And so we were driving back from I think a family meal or something, and I said, Mum, do you want to come in the car with me? She said, yeah, sure. And we did. And I was very defensive. I was so scared. I was so defensive. I said, Mum, I'm going to tell you something, but I don't want anything to change. I don't want any special prayers. I don't want you and Dad to go to the temple about me. I don't want to become an issue. I don't want just hear it, and then we just move on. And so I told her, and she was just very kind, and she was very lovely, and but she said, when we got back to the house, she said, can you do me a favor? I said, what? She said, can you tell Dad? And that was not, I hadn't even crossed my mind. That hadn't even crossed my mind. And my dad is a very nice, very loving, very kind person, but I never talked to him about anything like this, and I couldn't have thought of anything worse. I'd seen the films. I'd seen it, what happens when you tell Dad. So I said to her, okay. And so I went into the house. I said, Dad, do you want to come out on a quick drive? And I told Dad, and he was very good about it. Different than Mum. And he said, look, if you told me 10 years ago, you probably would have got a very different reaction. But he said, I've evolved in my thinking, and things have changed over the years. I don't understand it. He's also a biochemist, so he then went on to talk to me about all of the estrogen and chemicals in the water and how that has an effect on people. And so I just listened. Listened, and oh, that's nice, Dad. That's nice. But they've been incredibly supportive. They've been absolutely really, really wonderful. But I was scared to death to tell them. I mean, to tell your parents at 31, 30, 32, 33, whatever it was, that was particularly difficult. And then I guess I slowly decided to tell very close friends, of course, none of whom were overly surprised. And, almost all of whom were very supportive. And, there was obviously lots of people that gave me words of caution, and be careful, and you love the gospel, you love Christ, you love Jesus, and maybe don't tell people at church. And it's lots of people with very meaning advice. And I've come across various types of people at church, really supportive people who I wouldn't think would be supportive, who have been, others who maybe have felt uncomfortable in a way that I didn't think they would. And I think, growing up in the 90s, I'd internalized that people with same-sex attraction were kind of sex deviants. They were very sex mad, that they probably weren't safe around children. I think there was definitely that sort of the church's scouting movement, and we can't have gay leaders. And I had internalized that too. I remember saying, yeah, absolutely can't have gay scouting leaders because, that's not safe. And of course, now I look back and think, oh my gosh, statistically, I actually think it's probably more unsafe to have a married man with children than it is to have a gay person. That's not been my experience in the gay community at all. So, a lot of prejudice. I've had a lot of prejudices. And then came, I guess, 33, probably 33, 34, were the years where I really started to look around me, and I really started to see everyone else's marriages and children and family units and happiness in the gospel and place in the church and acceptance and love and validation for the lifestyles that they were leading, being something that I missed, that I was missing out on. And so then it was never a massive question in my mind to, well, because I'm gay, it means that all the other things that I felt at church are not true. I couldn't deal with that. That didn't make any sense to me. I'd had all those experiences. I had this strong testimony of the gospel. There's lots of parts of the gospel that were very, 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 very strong. They resonated very strongly with me. And I'll give you an example. Before my mission, I committed myself to reading 4 chapters of the Book of Mormon a day before I left on my mission. That was really hard. I never particularly had a massive desire to read the Book of Mormon before my mission. I read it in seminary and read it, blah, 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 blah. But the stories are complicated. There's lots of characters. The Old English is tricky. And so, a chapter, fine. 2, maybe 4. 4 was a challenge. 4 was a challenge. And I can remember getting to the end of Alma, maybe just after Alma, and I was sitting in my parents' lounge, and it was middle of the day. I wasn't working. It was deadly silent in the house. And I got to the end of that 4th chapter. I closed the book, and I had the most incredible experience. I felt the Spirit, the strongest I maybe have ever felt it in my life, resonate in every corner of that room. And I felt on fire. It was an answer. It was an absolute answer to my prayers of, I need to know this book is true before I go on my mission. And I was able to take that with me on my mission and teach the people of South America. And I was able to teach them about their stories. And it was really awesome. I felt that Spirit really strongly with Native South American and Indian people. Oh, I felt it so strongly. And I needed that experience. So I wasn't going to throw away that divine heavenly experience that I'd had, that was absolutely, you couldn't reason it out to be anything but a sign and a message from God, because I had this sexuality that didn't fit in the church. It didn't seem right. I couldn't throw that away to accept this over here. But that's when massive amounts of overthinking started, was around about 33. Yeah, loads. And it put me into a pretty depressive state. and I would, mask that very well, but I was deeply unhappy. And I felt like there was something huge missing from my life, but I didn't feel I had permission to explore any of it. And of course, salvation was a massive concern. It was a massive question. How could I possibly ever make it home? something else that was on my mind, and something that's been a pressure in my life is, and I don't mind sharing this, when I was born, I had a twin, and that twin passed away at 3 months old. So for all of my life, I've known that I've got a brother, a twin, passed away, 3 months, and that twin didn't need this earthly experience. And I guess I've always felt connected to this person. And so I've always known that if I don't make it home, and if I don't live my life a certain way, and if I don't keep commandments, if I don't behave, I'm not going to make it home. He's made it home. He's already ticked all the boxes. There's no trial for him. He's not on the judgment. He's not in the judgmenty life that we're in. And so I've always felt like if I muck it up, I'm never going to make it home, and I'm never going to see him. And that was really hard. So that's been really difficult. And how could I do that to my parents? How could I not make it home and not be as a family with my parents when one of us has already made it? And so, around that time, I was working for the church in their publishing services department, and that was hard. The church employment doesn't have, or didn't have at the time, any sort of protection for sexuality. No one was out. No one in the building. I think there are other people, but I don't know. Never asked. You don't ask. It is a don't ask, don't tell situation. And I felt vulnerable, felt very vulnerable. Everyone else is married. I was asked all the time, every day, when you're getting married, who are you getting married to? Come on, hurry up, get some kids. What's wrong with you? Probably the most unkind thing I've heard at church was, there's some sister somewhere, crying every night into her pillow because you won't take her to the temple. That was too much for me. That was too much for me. That was really hard. I've never forgotten that. And I just wanted to be in a place that supported me, and that place just didn't support me at all. And again, it was difficult because I had some great experiences working for PST, awesome experiences working with apostles and general authorities around the Pacific, doing some incredible work with incredible people. And I think that the work they do there is awesome, but the diversity is limited, very limited. I didn't play the game. I wasn't married, I didn't have kids. And I think there was probably some people that felt uncomfortable about that. And look, if people didn't know that I was gay working there, I would be very surprised. But you couldn't bring it up. You couldn't talk about it. And the pressure was massive. And so, I left church employment and went on to contract. And then I worked for Ministry of Health. And then I was now a part of Ministry of Health, and the department that I was in had a CEO who was gay, and it was like night and day. It was incredible. I was working there in an environment where people didn't care. It was, hey, you're gay. I don't care. Cool, awesome. CEO's gay. There was an awesome, inclusive environment of people who were super positive and validating and wonderful and amazing. And it was incredible. I was able to go to work and I could just be myself. I could 100% be myself. I couldn't at church, but I could at work. And I'd never experienced that before. And no one cared. No one cared. They all knew. They all knew I was gay, and I was open with them. I was open with them before I was open with people at church. I was open with strangers at work, and I could just, it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. I felt it was so freeing. And I think that had a massive impact on me feeling like, actually, even though that I've surrounded myself in an organization, an environment where I'm fundamentally not normal and I don't fit and I feel shy and I feel vulnerable, that's not actually how I need to feel, because over here at work I feel great, free and happy, and no one asks me, are you getting married? What's going on? What's the next steps? Are you keeping the commandments? Do you have a temple recommend? No one cares. It was amazing. It was amazing because I was just being accepted for me and who I am, without any sort of conditions. And And so it was around that time period that I met a less active member who also experienced same-sex attraction. And we had, I don't know, probably about a year and a half of a non-sexual relationship that was a companionship, really. And that was really amazing. He was, I guess the term would be, he was very straight acting. I hate to use that term. I know some people don't like it, but he wasn't. You wouldn't have known he was gay. There was no indication. So he could be my friend, just my friend, and that was really nice because I didn't have to. Nobody asked me about him. We were just friends. I was helping him come back to church, and we were friends. But we could be more than that together because we could be connected, and I felt like there was some sort of relationship, even if it wasn't physical. And I told my parents, and my nieces and nephews called him uncle, and it was really nice. It felt normal in a way, and I had companionship. I had somebody to do the washing with and the laundry, and make meals, and go off and visit places and go to a restaurant and go to the cinema, and it was just nice. And I never experienced that sort of peace in myself before. But he had a lot of underlying issues in himself, and some of those issues were connected to his childhood and the expectations put on him in his family to also not be gay, I guess, and not talk about that much more than was in mine. And so he created a bit of a other persona, other narrative, and I didn't quite know who he really was. And I found out there was lots of things he'd lied about, lots of parts of his life that he'd lied about because he didn't want to disappoint me, and he lied about because that's kind of just, I guess, the person that he was for people that he didn't know. And so finding out about all these lies was really, really hard. And I said to him, look, I can't be with you. I'm just enabling this behavior. And it affected me enormously. And I don't want to get into all of the details, but some of them they were really well constructed lies that had lasted a long time. And he's not a bad person at all. He's just had a very, very, very difficult upbringing and a very difficult time. During the time we were together, his mum had a couple of heart attacks and an aneurysm, and ended up, from what appeared normal and healthy to a vegetative state that she's still in now. So it was an incredible, difficult time for him. And so then I dived into this kind of ultra depression of losing, for the very first time, someone that made me feel normal. And I feel so sorry for all my flatmates at the time. I was a wreck. I was an absolute wreck. One of them is also LDS and gay, and had his own journey he was on. And he was kind of living life a little bit differently than I was, but we, really good friends. And it was amazing to have him as a support. And, I think it was really him that, I guess, kind of moved me to being more in a place where I felt like I was allowed to maybe go and find someone else, because I never felt allowed. I never felt allowed to go and look for anybody or find anyone or have anyone for myself, have a partner. I never felt allowed. The first person in my life came by accident, and I never felt I was proactively allowed to go and look. And I guess he kind of, in a way, gave me permission, just to go out there and look. And so for the very first time, I actually put my face on a dating app looking for men. And I was petrified. I had convinced myself that somehow, church leaders and my mum was going to, find me. And he reassured me that they're not on that app. And I did. I felt scared to death. My bio was basically, interested in going on dates, getting to know people, no hanky panky, nothing more. That was kind of the bio. Don't hit me up for any quick time fun. That's not why I'm here. And so a lot of people did hit me up because they'd never seen that sort of bio before. They weren't used to go out on a picnic and walk along the beach and talk about life. And so I got to know all these different people, and eventually found my now partner, who we were just looking for authentic companionship at the same time. And he's Pentecostal, I'm Mormon. He hadn't been to church in a while, and he's been out with me to church over 100 times. It's been really nice. And he's got a great testimony of the gospel, the Savior, and there's 1,000 things that we connect with. I don't think that we really do see the Savior and God any differently at all. I think we, Christians, we fundamentally see him the same. We call different names and we have different, hymns and way of doing things, but we're so similar. We're all so similar. And I would love him to join the church, but it's incredibly awkward and difficult because we live together in the same house. And, we started this relationship, with very minimal physical intimacy, and there's been a bit more over time. And it's still something that is really awkward and I find is difficult. And I find is not something that I can particularly, enjoy or relax or have in my life. I still feel very, I guess, conflicted in that, but the amount of peace and joy and love and purpose and he brings is innumerable. It's enormous. It adds. It's like my life previously was black and white, and now it's in color. And no one wants to watch black and white TV for their whole life. And I'm my health is better, my mental health is better, my relationship with my family and my friends is better. I'm just a better person, and that's my grapplings. I go to church. I probably just do sacrament meeting, I'll be honest. I struggle with Sunday school. But I love the gospel and I love the Savior. And I think I've come to learn an enormous amount about God through these experiences that I wouldn't have learned otherwise. If I had stayed in that kind of state of, if I do nothing, nothing will go wrong. And I've got a really lovely bishop. As Bishop Roulette goes, I've got a lovely bishop. And there's some lovely members in my ward. There's a family who have a gay son who's my friend. I don't think I'm supposed to mention names, but they know who they are, and they're lovely. I have so much respect for anybody that is willing to just do a little bit of research and take a bit of time to understand what it's like for LGBTQ plus rainbow community at church. I think there are a minority of members that don't want to look at it, don't have the time for it, and kind of weaponize the gospel to allow themselves that sort of room to not have to. And they say, well, I don't have to because it's wrong. I have enormous respect. My dad's come a long way too. He's come a long way. Recently, I went to their house and they've got a new missionary couple in their branch. And I wasn't there, but my friend was there. And she said, your dad introduced your partner to the missionary couple as your partner. And the missionary couple either didn't hear him or didn't want to hear him. So he reiterated it again and said, this is Tom's partner, and said partner quite loudly. And I tell you, Dad wouldn't have said that 2 years ago. He wouldn't have said that 6 months ago. So he's coming along. So yeah, I think that you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I've had incredible experiences at church, and I've learned so much, and it's helped me to grow and understand my theology of the Savior. And I know that I shouldn't talk about this because you told me not to, but I'm not going to say where or when, but there was a speaker that talked around about people's own truths and theologies on things. And I genuinely believe that we all have our own idea of God. We all do, through our lived experience. And, we rely on him differently and we understand him differently. There are times in my life where he's been very vocal and he's been a little chastising. There's times where he's been very loving and kind and accepting and absolutely, comforting beyond. And I've seen all these beautiful different sides of God that I've needed at different times in my life. And I think we have to allow each other to build our own theology of God. We have to. I think that the gospel is an enormously important place to learn how to connect with God. But I don't think it has a monopoly on who he is for us individually. I think we have to learn that ourselves. And I think there's a lot of people that are fearful. They're fearful to go out and ask him for themselves things that they would prefer just to ask leaders. They'd prefer to have someone just tell them what to do. And that's not possible for people with same-sex attraction, LGBTQ plus, rainbow community. If I'd just gone to my stake president and my bishop my entire life and said, right, what's the next step? I probably wouldn't be here because it's too limiting. They don't have enough information. It's not their fault. They don't experience this. It's a really hard thing for LGBTQ plus in the church because there is almost not one single priesthood leader, general authority or apostle that really, truly can connect with what they're going through because it's so removed and distant from where they're at through their lived experiences, which isn't their fault. And I tell that to members. I say, look, you don't have to listen to the whole of General Conference. If there's a speaker that triggers you, don't listen to them. Listen to someone else. Because the reality is they don't have the sort of experience that you have. And so where they're coming from is a completely different space. In particular, they're not subject experts at this. And what they're pulling from is probably some very old-fashioned, antiquated experience. When a lot of the apostles and general authorities were young, this was very frowned upon, illegal in some places, and a part of society that wasn't accepted in mainstream Christianity at all. And so I'm very sympathetic towards that. And I think that's where the community and the leaders need to compromise. And they need to come to the table, both humble to listen to each other. But I've got a lot of hope. I'm seeing massive changes, not in church doctrine, but in church culture over the last 5 years. And that's really cool. That's really cool. Like I said in my Instagram post, changes in the temple, the church said, I quote, they said, well, for better racial diversification in the temple and an ongoing commitment to gender equality. And I was like, great, finally, that's awesome. President Nelson in his recent talk talked about, it being, I forget the phrasing he used, but, displeasing to God that there was any sort of division and any sort of attack on people based on, and he listed, gender and ethnicity, and he mentioned sexuality. It's the first time I can remember a prophet actually saying the word sexuality as a group of people who needed protecting. And I was like, oh, that's brilliant. He's 90-something years old, and he said sexuality in General Conference. I love it. So that's kind of my journey in a nutshell. Yeah. And I think, I don't know what else to say. Ask me some really difficult questions.
Well, I think on behalf of our listeners, first thing I want to say is thank you, Thomas, for this is really vulnerable. What you just did, really vulnerable. And that's a sign to me of great spiritual and maturity and mental maturity, and just your ability to talk about this journey in a public way. Probably something you never imagined you would ever do. And I think it's one of the finest moments of your life is, you coming out broadly 3 months ago, you coming out to friends and family, you coming out to Valerie, I think that's her name in the car, and now being on this podcast and continue to talk about it. And here's some notes I wrote down, listeners. I just recognized all the internalized homophobia that you didn't choose to have, but because of what you heard in society and what society said about gay people and all the narratives that you then obviously didn't want to be that. And I think getting out of the internalized homophobia and getting that out of your system is a good thing and something that God can help you do, listener, if you've got some of that. Straight people need to get that out of them so they can better support LGBTQ people. But I've seen a pattern a little bit with the younger people on the podcast. They get through that stage earlier. And I don't think it's because they're any more courageous than you. I think you just recognize the content you grew up with in the 90s that they missed. And so I just recognize we're making progress, and younger people are able to get through that quicker because they're just not exposed to us. It's not easy. I love that some of these phrases you've used, like help me felt normal, to talk about that first guy partner you had, who I don't even think was a romantic relationship, and just how your whole life you had not felt normal. I'm still back at your mission dinner on the last night of your mission, not feeling normal in what could have been and should have been one of your finest moments to feel normal and feel like full of hope and understanding of all the good you did. I love your phrase, peace in myself. You said some wonderful sort of phrases. I love that that's part of your journey, to find peace in yourself, and how that's been so hard to find, especially as you were, in this decade plus of trying to date women. And I recognize then how you said, I'm not going to hurt. This is sort of part of a beautiful love story, but it's painful for the personal sacrifice you made after you dated all those women for so long. I said, I'm not going to date anybody because I just don't want to hurt anybody. And here you are kind of sacrificing any future for you because you don't want to hurt anybody. And what a tough spot to be in. I love what listeners, I share this principle sometimes with President Nelson. I love the good things you said about him. He talks about the gathering of Israel, and I think of that couple in the West Indies that you knocked on their door and helped them, and maybe some people in Liverpool back in 1980 that I helped. Skelmersdale was the suburb I served a lot in. So I think of those people looking for the gospel, but I also think of LGBTQ Latter-day Saints. I think of our own people and our responsibility to gather. So as I'm listening to Thomas's story, I'm struck with the work we have to do to help people like Thomas feel gathered. And you can kind of go back through Thomas's story and recognize all the things we could have said that would have helped Thomas feel a feeling of belonging, that he felt at work and that he could be himself. And I don't think that changes our doctrine, just to be yourself. And for Thomas to be gathered doesn't change our doctrine. But what happened at your work was kind of a little bit of gathering that occurred. Is there was representation of other LGBTQ people. They were in leadership. You all seemed to be working together for a cause, and every part about you was needed in that cause. And you could just be yourself, and how healing that was for you. And that's sort of part of my vision of Zion, listeners, or gathering of Israel, is our LGBTQ Latter-day Saints to feel gathered. And maybe some of that's happening in your ward as you talk about a loving bishop. You talk about an accepting ward. You're bringing your boyfriend to church. People would say, well, that's not exactly the doctrine. But my feeling is church is a place that everybody should feel welcome. Elder Uchtdorf talks about there should be no sign at the door that says your testimony needs to be this high to enter, or this wide to be living a certain way. So the temple has a belief in behavior hurdle, but our congregations don't. And I think Christ have everybody felt welcome. So I'm glad for the most part. And I recognize the courage it takes to continue to go to church, wondering how you'll be received and what comments you might hear. And sometimes we need a bogeyman to to drive our point home. And sometimes LGBT people become the bogeyman to sort of talk about the last days or Satan confusing his children. And I teach our doctrine listeners, but I teach it without emotion, just a fact-based discussion of our doctrine. I've shared this story before, but I don't want to get too sidetracked from Thomas' story, but since you've got me back in England, our mission president in 1980 felt our culture was too much versus the Church of England, and we were demonizing them in a way that kept us from taking the positive message of the restoration of the people of Northwest England. So he did something really radical. He held an all-mission conference in a Church of England, and the vicar spoke, and we felt the Spirit. No one joined the Church of England, but he humanized this group of people for us. And he taught us we could have a fact-based discussion about the difference between the Church of England without demonizing them. And our doctrine could stand on its own merits without a bogeyman. We baptized, we were the top English-speaking baptizing mission in the whole church in the early 80s. And I think it's partly because of the culture he brought in. It was a holier, higher law. And so I think politics can stand on its own merits. We don't need a bogeyman to drive home our position. That creates often fear that creates community. Sometimes he'll hear a church talk. You talked of one where we're sort of in that narrative is the facts of our doctrine, which I support and invite people to follow. But the fear-based, emotionally charged narrative divides us in an unhealthy way. And I don't think it's the way Jesus taught. His ministry didn't do much of that, except maybe people that were in charge that marginalized people. So that's just some of my thoughts, that some of you that are regular listeners have heard some of that. Now, what Thomas, when I see someone sort of walking a less traditional path in the church, my old self would have said, well, you're on the slippery slope here, Thomas. My new self would say, I'm just going to let you write your story, Thomas. That's what we invite people to do. Write your story with Christ. Author your own story. And so I don't look at your story when you're teaching the MTC, when you're working for the church, when you're doing all these as a valid story, and now it's less valid. I just, as a fellow Latter-day Saint, said, write your own story. What a perfect time in your life to write your own story. You've been on this road, Thomas, for a long time. You felt suicidal ideation as you almost drove off that bridge because of the pain of this situation. And now you're in a good spot. And I just walk with you as you write your own story. I love your father introducing your partner. I don't think he sold out our church doctrine to do that. He just honored our doctrine to love one another and support each other and preserve their family relationship. And everybody has their agency. And I recognize if we are just throwing bombs at you for living the life you live, you might get really angry and bitter and cut yourself off from our church or family because you need to, just to preserve your mental health. But so I like that people are still putting their arms around you. And to me, that is honoring our doctrine. So I love you mentioning porn. We talk about it sometimes on that podcast, and I thought it was pretty brave. Porn listeners, you've heard me talk about this subject. Yeah, that's a sin, but I recognized in my YSA assignment, often it was more about what was at the bottom of the iceberg than porn. And if people could kind of figure out the bottom of the iceberg, often it was a way to connect, to deal with anxiety, to stress, to escape from the reality of their life. And yeah, it wasn't the best coping mechanism, and it's a sin. But often if people could put it in that context, and faith leaders helping somebody, they could get through that and really sort of address what was at the bottom of the iceberg. So I love you being honest with that segment of your story. Anyway, I know you've got a poem you want to share that you shared before we went live.
Right?
And I want you to continue share any other thoughts. These podcasts don't have a hard stop time, so I just want to make sure that you continue to share anything else that's on your mind or anything I've said that didn't quite sit well with you.
Well, no. Everything you said sits great. Look, I'm not going to speak for long. I realise that listeners may tune out and click out if I just ramble on for another 20 minutes. So I'll keep it short. But I guess to preface this poem, Just to preface this poem, I think I just wanted to say that my understanding of God, my level of compassion, empathy that I have for people has increased tenfold going through this journey that I've gone through. That even though maybe 5 years ago, I would have pled to have this trial taken from me, I can see with a little bit of time now between those 2 points, the amount of growth that never would have occurred any other way. There's no way I'd have the same level of empathy and compassion for other people. But there's also no way that I'd ever understand how God feels about his children without feeling like someone who has, because of their sexuality, felt expelled from the group in a way. So it's been a very, very interesting journey. Hand on my heart, I couldn't have said 5-6 years ago that I knew to what extent God loves his rainbow community. I couldn't, but I can now. And so that's what this poem is kind of based on. I came to my computer a few days ago and I was supposed to be doing some work. Classic ADHD symptom is you go and do something else. And I had this line pop into my head and I couldn't get it out. And I thought, fine, I'll entertain the idea of this line. And so I did. And half an hour later, I'd written this poem. Now, I do write. I'm not a poet. I don't write my feelings and thoughts. I don't get them out on paper as some people do, as some therapeutic way of coping with life. I just don't. So it was very out of character for me to write a poem. But I did. And I by the time I got to the end of it, I felt something. I felt like I'd learned something. I felt like my understanding of the theology of God had increased based on what I'd written. And I was kind of a bit taken back by it. So I thought, look, I'm going to share it because I hope, look, if anyone can take anything from this and learn anything from it, I'd be so happy. So I'll give it a read. Okay. What do you think that God will say when he meets the trans, the bi, and the gay? Will he feel that they have let him down with a misspent life out and about the town? Will he disapprove of the rainbow vibe, those high heel nights with the gold glitter tribe? Will he feel that they have failed him ever so, wasted their lives meant to learn and grow? Will disappointment be on his mind because they struggled with their given design? Will he shake his head because they have so failed to sentence them to be banished and jailed? Or may I suggest a different view, a most loving father who certainly knew, with eyes joy-filled, he's been waiting to say, there never really was any other way. No other narrative you've failed to enact, nothing you've missed because of something you lack. He knows the pain each sleepless night when hope and faith felt out of sight. And even when life hung by a thread, bitter thoughts filled with what can't be unsaid, he's heard each little tiny word, all judgments pass, every scorn inferred, careless questions asked. He'll reassure that he makes no mistakes, despite the constant mental dread and aches, and reaffirm, my children are all unique, the bold, the beautiful, and the meek. That this earth life was as much a test for those that feel they are the blessed. The plan was never to return unscathed, through life all lived perfectly well behaved, but instead to increase our compassion for all, these gifts from God earned fall after fall. To bear the burden of another's pain, to truly listen, let judgment abstain. To defend, to love, to walk with those, no matter the shoes, the bags, the clothes. The holy plan is done and firm set, divinely paid through his blood and sweat. Worry not, you're home now, my child whom I love. Wipe away those tears. We have plenty of room up above. A mansion prepared for everyone here, the trans, bi, and gay. It's not heaven without queer. Yeah, so I guess there's a lot of concepts, a lot of stuff in there. I felt like I'd got to know another level of the love that our Heavenly Father has for that community, writing that. And I've come a long way. And I think I can, for the very first time, I can say I'm grateful for this challenge in my life, as hard as it's been, for everything that it's taught me, and for everything that it's done to help me feel closer to the Savior. Because for many a time in my life, there's been no one else to talk to and nowhere else to go than to just pray. And now my community is wider, filled with lots of different people from all different walks of life who have faith in God. And some of them are where I'm at, some of them are at different places, different stations, different boats, different tracks. But the thing that we all have in common is that we've all got a trial that doesn't necessarily fit in the most, I guess it doesn't fit in the church in a sexy way. You know, I always wanted a trial in something else. You know, give me a drug addiction, or give me an anger management problem, or just give me something else. Anything else that the church has got a pamphlet and a program for. But actually, I'm grateful for what I've learned to have to forge my own path, to figure out how to keep the gospel in my life, but also to be true to the person that my Heavenly Father created.
I love your poem. Me. I love the poem. I think of Corinthians, Paul's vision of the body of Christ, and how consistent that is with the poem he wrote, and how God, you know, I think my younger self would have thought there's some backstory that happened, that something went haywire, so you're gay, and I can explain it with all the different theories, but my current self is, this is who you are, Thomas, and it's a good thing. And nothing went awry here. It's part of God's needed, beautiful diversity, and you being who you are, the authentic Thomas Swain, is a good thing. I'm struck with, you being this age, and most of your life is probably still ahead of you. I'm looking at life expectancy tables.
I hope so.
And that would only put you in your early 70s. And I wonder if your 75-year-old self would come on a podcast one day and say, I actually feel like I help more people post coming out. And the best 35 years of my life are actually the 35 years that happened since coming out. And I say that in the context of 3,600 missionaries that, you influenced at the New Zealand MTC. All the good you've done in so many circles in our church and help people come into Christ and feel God's love and commitment to the gospel of Jesus Christ, and how that, I think you could have just said, well, you're kind of living with the paradox. I'm gay and I love the gospel, and I'm holding on to both of those the best way I can. And there's no owner's manual written for that, as you've said, but there is in some ways. It's personal revelation in your relationship with God and the Savior. But I just wonder, and maybe I don't want to put pressure on you because it'll be a less formal way, but I think you'll continue to help people because that's part of your mission, Thomas, and your vision for inclusivity and welcoming and all of God's children, and your understanding of God's love for everybody. I just wonder, you'll look at the second half of your life, and it's not quite halves because most of your life is still ahead of you. And that gives me hope for the world and for your mission. And I look at and the fact of you coming out makes all that possible. So anyway, I think of those sort of things. I also think I sometimes talk about this false dichotomy that to fully love and follow God, we have to stop loving some of his children. And I love that people generally are not doing that with you, your family, your ward members. I just think one of the best ways we can show God our love and support for him is to love all of his children. I know as a parent, when other people love all of our children, that brings us great joy. And often it's their help that lifts the burdens of our children. So I love this human family that I think at times can be really painful for our heavenly parents if we divide and the vitriol that President Nelson was trying to get us away from. But if we can come together, Zion to me is not sameness, but Zion is unity and love and support and helping everybody feel like they belong and are needed. And you're helping us do that, and your story moves us. So I invite listeners to act on your impressions you felt. I'm listening to Thomas's story. If you're LGBTQ, if you're an ally or a local leader, and I'm grateful for your courage, Thomas, to share your story. You're a good man. And I think you've walked this really difficult road as well as possible, and you're in a great spot. And the world's better with you here in it, and our faith community is better with the contributions you've made and the contributions you'll continue to give to make this world a better place. But that's all I'm going to say, listeners. I promise. I'm going to turn it to Thomas just to see if any last thoughts.
No. You need to end it quickly because everyone on the podcast is bored to death of me now. They just want to go. I've got two tiny things to say. And one is, if you're LGBTQ+, if you're rainbow community, the best thing that I've done is get a support network of people around me. People that are there for me. If I need to pick up the phone, discuss something, have a chin wag. There's good days, there's hard days, there's amazing days, there's terrible days. That support network has been invaluable. And they don't have to be LGBTQ+ people in that support network. They can be any walks of life people, just anyone that's there to support you. Develop that support network, and anyone that's not LGBTQ+ in listening, just offer to be that support person, and it doesn't have to be formal, just be open to helping and being a part of those people's lives, because I believe that is exactly what the Savior would want us to do, to bear one another's burdens that they may be light. I think there's a lot of people that feel very safe staying with the 99, not so comfortable with the one, but go after the one. Please go after the one. And I don't think that there are ones that are more deserving of help than the rainbow community in the church. I feel that they are the group that, for the very first time, we potentially have the opportunity to keep a generation of rainbow community members in chapels. It's never happened before. There's never been a generation that we've had rainbow community people stay in chapels. But I think this one, we have that opportunity. I believe personally that in years to come, we'll see, I love the word gathering. You've said gathering a lot. I love the word gathering. And I think in years to come, we will see the church make a massive special effort to gather those members when it's time, when it's politically possible, when it's going to happen. I think it should be happening now, but it's not, but that's fine. We can do that. But I think the last thing that I'll say as well is, I think for a lot of my life, I've always thought to myself, if I can just get a letter to the right leader, things will change. If I can just get a letter to my stake president, to the Area 70, to the general authority, to the apostle, to the prophet, if I can just talk with them, things will change. But in fact, what I've come to learn is that things will change as every individual member makes an effort to do their best to be kind and loving, like the Savior would want them to be, towards a vulnerable community of people who feel lost. That's how we will make change. And when that becomes generally accepted in the church, that people feel loving and kind towards this community, and we are able to get out of the divisive politics and all of the rest of things that people have grown up with, we will create an environment where leadership are allowed to, with open arms, be more kind and open and honest around how we can include this community on a more formal level. I'm not saying doctrine's going to change, but I think we can all do our part.
I love that. I love that because we can all control that. I love focusing on things that we can control, and we can all, in our local area of influence, do what we can. And that was a golden segment. So listeners, this is I'll put, if you're wondering how to find Thomas, I will put his Instagram and his Facebook in the show notes of the podcast, and I'll put this on my Instagram and Facebook so you can DM Thomas if you want to talk to him further. But this is Richard Ostler and Thomas Swain signing off from another, and we didn't have an earthquake in New Zealand, signing off from another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.